How's everybody doing? It's great to be with you on a Tuesday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us for a really interesting daf? And just a single page and a fascinating page and no highly problematic material. This is a good one. Who's with us? Scrolling. Bill in Mid-Missouri, Yehud in South Carolina, Renee in Indiana, James in Annapolis, Clarice in Mexico City, Bienvenida Clarice, Shandora in the Bronx, Paul in the Great Northwest, Paula in Chicago, Bella in Florida, Ruth in Kentucky, Martha in SoCal in the hospital. May you have a refuah shlema, a complete healing, and may it be speedy, and we say amen. Tom in Pennsylvania, Carolyn in Raleigh, Nancy in North Carolina, Amador in Salt Lake City, John in Maine, Janique in Boston, Dawn in LA, Lucy in Minnesota, Guy in Ohio, Pauline in Chicago, wait, it's skipping on me, Ira in New Jersey, Sharon in New Jersey, and people are praying for each other. Love to see that. Marjorie in Virginia, welcome everybody. Our daf is Mem Ches, page 48 here in Tractate Kesubos, the 15th volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 4. Today, completing our discussion of Mishna number 4 and opening Mishna number 5. And now we're finally in this tractate about marital contracts, getting into the rights and obligations of the spouses in the marriage. It's like the sages get all the more difficult material out of the way first, and then we get into what we thought we would have been learning from the beginning. We picked this up near the bottom of page 47b, and we've been talking basically about the kind of transfer, right, from of a young woman leaving her father's household in the ancient world, entering her husband's household. This was back then done at a quite young age. And so you can understand that first the father is responsible for her sustenance, and then the husband is responsible for her sustenance. And the father's entitled to her earnings if she's hired out as a laborer. And then the husband gets entitled to those earnings, but not in every case. These are the general laws, but as we'll see, there's all kinds of hypothetical issues and not so hypothetical interruptions in that journey that the woman can take from her father's house to her husband's house, and what happens to the laws of inheritance, earnings, authority, etc. We picked this up at the bottom of near the bottom of 47b. The Mishnah teaches that a husband is obligated to provide his wife with sustenance, feed her, redemption from captivity if she gets kidnapped or captured by an opposing army, and she can be redeemed with money, and he's responsible for her burial if, God forbid, she dies. Now, the sages taught in a baraisa, the rabbis instituted that a husband must provide his wife with her sustenance in exchange for his rights to her earnings. And similarly, they decreed that a husband must tend to her burial in exchange for the fact that he inherits the dowry that she brought into the marriage, and which is written into her marriage contract. Says the Gemara, consequently, the husband may consume the produce of her property. If she brings a field into the marriage and it produces crops at certain times during the year, so he's entitled to add the wealth of that produce from her field kind of into the household earnings, even though if they divorce, she will leave with the field that she brought into the marriage. He can consume the produce. So the Gemara expresses surprise at this last statement. Produce? Who mentioned anything about produce? And the Baraisa did not previously mention produce at all. So how did it arrive at a halachic conclusion with regard to produce? And the Gemara explains that the Baraisa is incomplete. And this is what it is teaching. They, the sages, instituted that a husband must provide his wife with her sustenance in exchange for his rights to her earnings, and it is his duty to provide her with redemption from captivity in exchange for his right to consume the produce of her property, and it is his obligation to attend to her burial in exchange for the fact that he inherits the dowry that she brought into the marriage and which is written in the marriage contract. Consequently, a husband may consume the produce of her property. Now, although the Gemara has explained how the Tana, the rabbi of the Mishna or of the Baraisa, came to speak about produce, so the wording of the Baraisa still remains problematic. What is the significance of the word consequently? Consequently. Why is that word used in this context? Could have said, it could have been included without the word consequently. That's going to make a link between a cause and an effect. So the Gemara explains, lest you say that the husband should not consume the produce, but he should leave it, so that if he requires these funds to redeem his wife, he will have them available in case she's ever kidnapped. As if he is not compelled to set her produce aside, potentially to redeem her from captivity, he may refrain from redeeming her, as he will be unwilling to spend his money for that purpose. Lest you think this, the Tana therefore teaches us that this arrangement is preferable because sometimes the produce will not amount to the funds necessary to redeem her from captivity, and then he would not redeem her if he was only expecting to redeem her from the funds set aside from her produce. Consequently, the sages decreed that he consumes the produce immediately when she enters the marriage, and that he must redeem her from captivity, not from those funds, but from whatever funds he has available. Obviously, the husband has to redeem his wife from captivity. Who would have thought that a husband wouldn't redeem his wife from captivity? I suppose a marriage could be going badly, and this guy might have thought, I didn't know how I was going to get out of that marriage, but now that she's kidnapped, oh well. No, obviously not. A man has an obligation to redeem his wife from captivity no matter what. Where am I? So the Gemara, hold on a second, let me make sure. Yes, and after analyzing the language of the Baraisa, the Gemara turns its attention to the law itself. But, says the sage who's analyzing this, I can reverse these connections. Why does the Baraisa say that a husband's obligation to provide his wife with sustenance was instituted in exchange for his right to her earnings, as opposed to another of his rights, i.e., for example, his right to consume the produce of her property? Why are you linking these rights, these particular rights, with these particular obligations? Why not just say, these are his rights, these are his obligations? Why are you going to make these linkages between a particular right and a particular obligation? So Abaye said, the sages instituted a common obligation in exchange for a common right. Things that come up all the time, they're linked to things that come up all the time. And they instituted an uncommon obligation, like redeeming from captivity, in exchange for an uncommon right, like produce, which doesn't come due every day, but maybe only seasonally. So in other words, the sages instituted her husband's obligation to provide his wife with sustenance, which is relevant on a regular basis, in exchange for his right to her earnings, which also applies regularly, and the other obligations and rights of a husband are relevant less frequently, and that seems to be the reason that they made this linkage. Rava said, this Tana, this rabbi in the Baraisa, cited below, maintains that the obligations of a husband to provide his wife's sustenance applies by Torah law as opposed to rabbinic decree, as it is taught with regard to the verse pertaining to a husband's obligations toward his wife, quote, if he take another wife for himself, her food, she'era, her clothing, kasuta, and her conjugal rights, onata, he shall not diminish. That's Exodus 21:10. She'era, this is sustenance. He has to feed her. This Hebrew word she'era refers to sustenance. How do we know? Likewise, it states in Micah 3:3, who also eat the flesh, she'er, of my people. Totally different context, but that word is used in a way that refers to eating. Kasuta, this is understood in its literal sense as referring to clothing. Onata, this is her conjugal rights, which is stated in the Torah, and so it says, if you shall afflict ta'aneh, my daughters, in Genesis 31:50, which indicates that a husband may not deprive his wife of her conjugal rights. This is an absolute law, still applies today. A husband married to a woman, right now we're talking about his obligation toward her. She has an absolute right to receive marital relations from her husband. Elsewhere in the Talmud, there's actually a definition of depending on the livelihood, depending on the career, the job. In other words, how busy and how hardworking the man is, there are different frequencies. Right, like a camel driver who's often on the road, he has to provide his wife with conjugal relations, I think, once a month. Whereas a Torah scholar has to provide his wife with conjugal relations once a week. And I think some people daily, if that's what she wants, right? She can demand and he must provide. So at any rate, here we learn she has a right to have sex in the marriage and he must provide it. And if not, it's a serious transgression. So the Baraisa continues. Rabbi Elazar defines these words differently. Rabbi Elazar says, She'era, this is her conjugal rights. And so it says, Leviticus 18:6, none of you shall approach to any who is near, she'er, of kin to him to uncover their nakedness. Those are actually the prohibitions of you can't have sex with your relatives. So this word she'er seems to be near, and it's in this passage that has to do with sex. So she'era must refer to sex, conjugal rights. Kesuta, here it's understood in its literal sense as referring to clothing. Onata, this is sustenance, and so it says, and he afflicted you, vayaneka, and made you suffer hunger, and fed you with manna. Deuteronomy 8:3. Now we're on 48a. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that she'era and kesuta should be interpreted like this. In accordance with her flesh, she'era, i.e. her age, give her clothing, kesuta. And this means that he should not give the garments of a young girl to an elderly woman, nor those of an elderly woman to a young girl. In other words, sustaining your wife doesn't just mean giving her food. It means giving her what she needs. Age-appropriate clothing and anything else, right? You have an obligation to make your wife happy, not just the bare minimum. So age-appropriate clothing. Similarly, kesuta and onata are linked. In accordance with the time of year, onata, give her clothing. Kesuta, meaning that he should not give new heavy clothes in the summer, nor worn-out garments in the rainy season, meaning the winter, when she requires heavier, warmer clothes. So the entire phrase, therefore, refers only to a husband's obligation to provide clothing, age-appropriate and season-appropriate clothing for his wife. Rav Yosef taught the following baraisa, she'era, this is referring to closeness of flesh during intercourse, which teaches that the husband should not treat her in the manner of the Persians. What do the Persians do? The Persians have conjugal relations in their clothes. So the Gemara comments, this baraisa supports the opinion of Rav Huna. As Rav Huna said, with regard to one who says, I do not want to have intercourse with my wife unless I am in my clothes and she is in her clothes, this man must divorce his wife and give her payment for her marriage contract. And this is in keeping with the opinion of the Tana of the Baraisa that the Torah mandates the intimacy of flesh during sexual relations. Lest a man think that he could demand that he and his wife both be dressed when they're making love. No, that is cause for divorce if she wants it, and he must give it and pay the full marital contract if he's got this hang-up that he will only make love wearing clothing. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Yehuda says, even the poorest man of the Jewish people may not provide fewer than 2 flutes and a lamenting woman for his wife's funeral. The Gemara infers this proves by inference that the first anonymous Tana cited in the Mishnah holds that these are not part of a husband's obligations. If one says the minimum funeral that you can give your wife is 2 flutes and a lamenting woman, and this is one side of the opinion, must be the other side says you don't even need to provide that. Is that so? What are the circumstances? If this is the common custom in her family at funerals, what is the reason for the opinion of the first Tana who said that he does not have to do so? If he neglected to provide these items, he would be treating her with disrespect. And if this is not the common custom in her family, well then what is the reason of the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? So the Gemara answers, no. it is necessary to state this dispute in a case where it is the common custom for his family according to its social status, but it is not common for her family according to their social status. And the first Tana holds, when we say that a woman who marries a man ascends with him, i.e. she must be treated as equal in status to her husband if his social status is higher than hers. And she does not descend with him. If she marries down, as it were, with a man of lower social status, well, this applies only when they are alive. But after death, the sages did not enforce this rule. And Rabbi Yehuda maintains, no, even after death, she must be treated in accordance with his status, which means that if those in his family are mourned with flutes and lamenting women, he must provide the same for her funeral. And Rav Chisda said that Mar Ukva said the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And as we'll see, the general principle is you have to honor your wife. So if she comes from a lower social status family, so then at the time of her burial, you bury her according to the standards of your higher social status family. If she comes from a higher social status family and married down to this husband, then when she dies, he has to give her the kind of funeral that her family is accustomed to. Apropos this ruling, the Gemara cites another statement that Rav Chisda said that Mar Ukva said, with regard to one who became insane. The court enters his property and feeds and provides a livelihood for his wife, his sons, and his daughters, and it also gives something else, as will be explained. And Ravina said to Rav Ashi, in what way is this case different from that which is taught in a baraisa? In the case of one who went overseas and his wife claims sustenance, the court descends to his property and feeds and provides a livelihood for his wife, but not for his sons and daughters, and does not give something else. So if a father is not obligated to sustain his children in his absence, what is different about a situation where he goes insane? So Rav Ashi said to Ravina, is there no difference for you between a man who leaves his responsibilities knowingly and one who leaves them unknowingly? A father who lost his sanity did not do so by his own choice, and therefore it can be assumed that he would want to provide for his children from his possessions, despite the fact that he is not obligated to do so. By contrast, if he went overseas, so then he freely decided to depart and take this risk that he wouldn't come back. And one would think that he would leave enough for his sons and daughters. And if he failed to do so, he has demonstrated that he does not want to provide for them. So the Gemara asks, well, what is this something else mentioned in the Baraisa? Rav Chisda said, this is a wife's ornaments, to which she is entitled in addition to her sustenance. So not only is the husband obligated to feed his wife, not only is he obligated to dress his wife, provide her the clothing that she needs, appropriate clothing that she needs, but also ornaments, jewelry, right? And so that's why, traditional Jews have a custom to give their wives nice gifts, usually at holidays, for Rosh Hashanah, for Passover. You should put out, a husband should put out, buy her some nice earrings, buy her a nice necklace, buy her nice things, a nice dress, a nice piece of jewelry. And that is something she is entitled to within a Jewish marriage. Rav Yosef said, actually, this something else is money for charity. Well, the Gemara comments, according to the one who says that the court does not pay for a woman's ornaments from her husband's property if he has gone overseas, all the more so he maintains that the husband's property is not taken for charity. But conversely, the one who says that the court does not give money for charity, he holds that this applies only to charity. But it does give her ornaments, as it is assumed that it is not satisfactory for him that his wife be demeaned by a lack of appropriate ornamentation. So Rav Chia bar Avin said that Rav Huna said, in the case of one who went overseas and his wife died, the court enters his property and buries her in accordance with his dignity. And the Gemara asks, does the court act in accordance with his dignity and not in accordance with her dignity? What if she came from a more dignified family than her husband? So the Gemara answers, say that Rav Chia bar Avin meant even in accordance with his dignity, i.e., if his family was more distinguished than hers, then he must bury her in accordance with the dignity of his family. The Gemara adds, this comes to teach us that she ascends with him to his social status, but she does not descend with him, as this principle applies even after her death, in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in our Mishna. Rav Matana said, in the case of one who says that if his wife dies, they should not bury her using funds from his property, the court listens to him. There he made his wishes known. The Gemara asks, well, what is different about the case when he says this command that induces the court to comply with his wishes? It is due to the fact that the property has come before the orphans as an inheritance, while the obligation to bury her is not incumbent upon them, the orphans, but is a duty of the inheritors of her marriage contract. However, even if he did not state the above preference, the property is cast before the orphans and it belongs to them. So what does it matter whether or not the husband issued a command to this effect? Rather, the Gemara amends Rav Matana's statement with regard to one who says that if he himself dies, they should not bury him using funds from his property. We do not listen to him. But the court spends his money without resorting to charity. And the reason for this is that it is not in his power to enrich his sons by saving them his funeral expense and to therefore cast the dead body as a burden on the community. If there's enough money in the inheritance to bury him, they have to bury him before they take their inheritance. And that concludes the Gemara on Mishnah number 4. Here's Mishnah number 5, here in chapter 4. Even after she is betrothed, a daughter is always under her father's authority until she enters her husband's authority in marriage via the wedding canopy. Now we're on 48b. If the father delivered his daughter to the husband's messengers to bring her to her husband and the wedding canopy, once she has been handed over from the father's, authority in his house to the messengers of the husband, then she comes under the husband's authority. However, if the father went with the husband's messengers, or if the father's messengers went with the husband's messengers, then she is still under her father's authority, as he has not fully delivered her to the husband's messengers. If her father sent her with his own messengers, and the father's messengers delivered the woman to the husband's messengers, then from that moment onwards, she is under the husband's authority. That's Mishnah number 5. Here comes the Gemara. The Mishnah taught that a daughter always remains under her father's authority until she has fully entered her husband's jurisdiction. So the Gemara asks, what is the significance of the term always in the Mishnah? And the Gemara explains this comes to exclude the opinion stated in the initial version of the Mishnah. As we learned in a Mishnah later in this tractate on page 57a, if the time that the groom designated for the wedding arrived and the wedding was postponed and they were not yet married, so then the brides are entitled to eat from his food, and if he is a priest, to eat teruma, like married women. And the Mishnah here teaches us that the law is not in accordance with this earlier ruling cited in that Mishnah. Rather, they are always under the father's authority until they actually enter the wedding canopy, the chuppah. So the Mishnah taught that if the father delivered his daughter to the husband's messengers, she is under the husband's authority, unless the father or his messengers accompanied them. So Rav said, when her father delivers her, she leaves his jurisdiction in all respects, apart from the issue of partaking of teruma. Right? So if she comes from a regular, the family of a Yisrael, right, that was not a priestly family, so she can't eat teruma in her father's household. And she's marrying a Kohen, she's marrying a priest. So once she becomes the priest's wife, then she can eat consecrated food, teruma, that's only for priests and their families. When she's merely betrothed to a priest, she cannot yet eat teruma. When she marries the priest, then she can eat teruma. Oy vey, let me just say, I didn't share the... Nina is away delivering accompanying our daughter to college this week. So I'm going to be alone all week. I'll have to scan the comments for your comments and questions. And before the show started, I was supposed to share it into a couple of groups that we always share into. I forgot. So I'm just doing that right now. Yeah, got it. Post. Sorry about that. This is the job that Nina does behind the scenes, and I just forgot to do it, but I did it now. Okay. Right. So, sorry, where was I? So anyway, a girl who comes from the family of a Yisrael cannot eat teruma even when she's betrothed to a priest, not until she actually marries the priest, and then her right to eat consecrated food that's only edible by priests, her right to eat that only kicks in once they're actually married. Right? So Rav Huna raised an objection to the opinion of Rav Asi, and some say that it was Chia, the son of Rav, who raised an objection to the opinion of Rav Asi. So the Mishnah states that she is always under her father's authority until she enters the chuppah, the wedding canopy. So according to Rav Asi, however, as soon as her father delivers her to the husband's messengers, she is no longer under her father's authority. And Rav said to them, didn't I tell you not to follow, i.e. attempt to refute rulings on the basis of sources that can be explained in opposing manners? Rav Asi can answer you that the Mishnah means that her delivery to the husband's messengers is equivalent to her entrance to the wedding canopy, and then the same laws apply in both cases. And Shmuel said that once a woman's father has delivered her to the messengers of her husband, she is under the husband's authority only with regard to her inheritance, i.e. her husband inherits her property if she should die at this point, as though she had already entered the wedding canopy, but maybe not with respect to teruma. So Reish Lakish said, her delivery is also effective with regard to her marriage contract. And the Gemara asks, what is Reish Lakish referring to when he says she is under her husband's authority with regard to her marriage contract? If you say it means that if she dies, he inherits all her property, including the dowry specified in her marriage contract, well, that is the same as the statement of Shmuel. And Reish Lakish has added nothing new. So Ravina said Reish Lakish is coming to say that if the man dies before marrying her, and she then marries someone else, her marriage contract from the other man is 100 dinars, as she is considered a widow from marriage rather than a widow from betrothal. And that means that her presumptive status of virginity is no longer there. And that's why the minimum marriage contract would be 100 dinars of the non-virgin rather than the 200 dinars of a virgin. So Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Hanina both say that a woman's delivery to the messengers of her husband causes her to be under his authority for all matters, even including partaking of teruma. Once the father's messengers hand her to the husband's messengers, even though she hasn't yet been under the chuppah with her new husband, if he's a priest, she can eat his teruma. So the Gemara raises an objection from the Tosefta at Kesubos 4:4. Kesubos 4:4. If the father went with the husband's messengers, or if the father's messengers went with the husband's messengers, or if she owned a courtyard along the way and she entered with her groom to lodge, not for the purpose of marriage, but merely to stay overnight until they arrive at his residence, then even if the dowry specified in her marriage contract is already in her husband's house, if she dies, her father inherits from her, as she is not considered to have entered the husband's domain. And conversely, if the father delivered her to the husband's messengers, or if the father's messengers delivered her to the husband's messengers, or if the groom owned the courtyard along the way and she entered with him for the purpose of marriage, then even if the dowry specified in her marriage contract is still in her father's house and has not yet been given to her husband, if she dies, her husband inherits from her. So the Tosefta concludes, in what case is this statement said? It is stated with regard to the husband's right to inherit from her. However, with regard to teruma, the law is that a woman who marries a priest may not partake of teruma until she actually enters the wedding canopy. And this baraisa is apparently a refutation of all of them, i.e. all of the opinions cited previously that hold that once the woman is delivered to the husband's messengers, if the husband is a priest, the woman may partake of teruma. And the Gemara concludes, indeed, this is a conclusive refutation. She may not partake of teruma until she's actually married. Her husband might inherit from her once her father's messengers hand her off to the new husband's messengers. But in terms of eating teruma, not until she's actually married, standing under the wedding canopy with him. So the Gemara says, whoa. This matter itself is difficult. You said in the Tosefta that if she entered with him to her courtyard to lodge for one night. Now they're lodging together. They're acting like a husband and wife. So it would seem she's entered the husband's domain. to lodge for one night, and then she dies, but her father inherits her property. And the reason is because it is specified that they entered only to lodge there, not to live in the husband's house, to assume the status of man and wife. They were only lodging there for one night, even though the husband happened to own that place. From which it may be inferred that if they entered without specification to lodge there for one night, but rather they slept in a property of the husband, it is as though she entered for the sake of marriage. So say the latter clause of the Tosefta, if she entered with him to his courtyard for the purpose of marriage and she dies, her husband inherits her property. And this indicates that if she entered without specification, i.e. without saying they were doing so for the purpose of marriage, it is considered as though they merely intended to lodge there for one night. And the inferences from these two clauses of the Tosefta apparently contradict each other. I am almost done. If you've got questions or comments, get them in now. Rav Ashi said, this is an incorrect interpretation, as the Tana taught the halacha, the law, of entering one type of courtyard without specification, and the halacha, the law, of entering a different type of courtyard without specification. And this is what he meant. If they entered her courtyard without specification, it is assumed that they entered merely to lodge. Whereas if they entered his courtyard without specification, it is assumed that they did so for the sake of marriage, unless they expressly stated that they had a different purpose in mind. As you can see, they're getting into the nuance of when are they considered actually married, right? And this doesn't come up nowadays when the betrothal and the marriage all happen in the same day, but when the betrothal could be as much as a year earlier, and sometimes they lived in different cities, the father and the husband, and she's traveling, and so she enters the domain of the husband, when she accompanies the messengers that he sent to bring her. So that is for the purpose of inheritance, but maybe not for teruma. What if they travel together, this husband and this soon-to-be husband, these betrothed man and woman, soon-to-be husband and wife under the canopy, but then they lodged together, right? So they slept in the same room. Now, they're acting like a man and wife. Maybe they've already consummated the union, then forget that they haven't stood under the canopy. They're married. And if he's a priest, she should be able to start eating teruma. But we haven't fully solved this question yet, and we'll continue that tomorrow. All right, let me see if I can scan the comments. Normally Nina does this for me. It's not easy to scan the comments on Facebook. Bill says, I've always found it a source of immense amusement that the law is this way, that men have an obligation to reproduce, but women don't. And on the other hand, women have the right to demand sex. It's not, as we've discussed, enough to ensure the equality of the sexes, but it does suggest God has an interesting sense of humor. Agreed. Lewis says, at my yeshiva it was taught that it would be immodest for her to do anything like demanding. Instead, she gives him signs or hints that are known between them. Quite so, right? She can demonstrate that she has that expectation. She doesn't have to actually say it, right? And elsewhere we saw that in the Gemara, that, right, she makes it known, but it's considered immodest to say, hey, I want it now. There's better ways to communicate that. Very good. Sharon says, Jewish funeral practices require the use of a burial shroud. When a casket is used, it should be plain with no ornamentation. I understood this to be representation of us all, that we are all equal in death. Is the difference in status between the funeral practices, which is really for the community, not the wife per se? Well, in a sense, yeah. Right, the funeral practices that they're talking about, and the dignity of the burial is not the casket or the shroud, right, which is the same for everybody. But, what else are you arranging in terms of the shiva, the gathering afterward? Or in ancient times, very interesting, right, that they hired flute players and lamenting women to accompany the burial procession. Right? And you can imagine that rich people did a lot more than 2 flute players and 1 lamenting woman. But whatever the custom was, you had to step up to either the dignity of the man's family, the woman's family. She gets the better of the 2, right? Whichever's the better, that's what she's entitled to. And that's what I have for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday night. for page 49 here in Tractate Kesubos. Have a great